Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Opie and Anthony of Extreme Metal Podcasts. I am the Death Metal Guy, aka One Piece themed Funeral Doom Triptych.
One Piece themed Funeral Doom Triptych. What do you mean by One Piece?
One Piece is an incredibly long-running and incredibly boring anime.
Alright, well, I'm the Black Metal Guy, aka Trey Azagthoth, talking his way out of a DUI by sort of levitating up over the police car, over the telephone poles, and sort of floating away as the bullets pass through him.
If I was drunk, could I do this? Yeah, the One Piece thing would have landed way better if you were more of a weeb, man.
It's yeah, and you say you're not a weeb,
no, that's like bad anime.
Yeah, but you know what it is.
Yeah, because I live on the internet.
That's fair. To live on the internet is already to be a weeb.
God.
Yeah, but did you know that you remember the thing about Trey Azagthoth's DUI, right? Probably a lot of our listeners do.
I actually don't. I saw.
I think he told. Who knows? Maybe this is rumor, but like, if it's, I don't care. It's great, so it's in the lore now. Apparently, he told the cop he was a professional drinker.
And they said, "Oh, very good, sir. We don't want to interrupt you at work." Well, if you've been in Morbid Angel that many years, yeah, you can be a professional drinker, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been doing it for 35 years, that's fair. All right, we've got a show today. And holy shit, it finally happened. We've got a show that's mostly death metal. Have we ever pulled it off before?
Yeah, a few times.
Really? Okay, I hadn't even thought about it. This one seems much more death metal than usual. I don't know why.
Well, this is all, I think maybe in the past it's often involved some of that, you know, Ortho Cave. Please save us from that name. Someone come up with a better name for it. It's involved some of that Orthodox cavern, you know, textured, cavernous Orthodox BM stuff that's pretty death metal, you know, or, you know, something like that. But on this, there really is, in some way, like, I mean, we can find black metal influence strongly on the last thing, but there's basically no black metal here.
Yeah, it's it's actually happened. But before we go to the rundown, usual housekeeping, social media, follow us. Facebook at Terminus Podcast, that's me. And the Black Metal Guy is on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. Additionally, you can follow us and support us over on Patreon and Subscribestar. $3 and up gets you access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes, the newest one of which is going to be coming up probably within a day or two of you listening to this episode.
We've already recorded it. It's sick.
Yeah, it's a very weird one, but it's a very good one. And $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server where we discuss what the best Fallout game is and what bands sound like Seigneur Voland and rule, and which ones sound like Seigneur Voland and suck.
An important
That's about half the discussions we have on the
server.
But okay, so, like I said, this is overwhelmingly a death metal episode, and today we're opening with the debut record by a one-man project from Georgia called Alchemy of Flesh. Record is called Ageless Abominations. This is out now on Redefining Darkness. And this is a very open and very straightforward Morbid Angel worship project, spiced up with, you know, some other parts of Tampa death metal, but definitely an old school style death metal record of a fashion we don't often hear. And well, the result is, well, this guy really knows his Morbid Angel, and he really knows his way around a guitar, and definitely a fun one to talk about.
Yeah. So, next up, we've got some death metal from Connected from Finland. This is the Degeneration, and it is, as far as I can tell, a independent online release up to this point. It is, I think the quick way of describing this would be an attempt to distill a certain essence of early 90s extreme metal minus black metal. Sort of thrashing death metal that's also very catchy in a way that's uncommon now.
Yeah, it's another very fun record. After that, well, you know I had to do it to him. We have the latest record by Cerebral Effusion with Ominous Flesh Discipline out on, unsurprisingly, New Standard Elite. For those who don't know, Cerebral Effusion, long-running Spanish brutal death band with their first record in 7 years. And I will have to make a legitimate pitch for why this is as good as I think it is, and why you should listen to it, even though, to the untrained ear, it is literally just for half an hour.
I would class myself at this point as relatively trained, and boy, is it that. All right. And finally, we've got Wyrtgurn's A Legacy of Spite out on tape on Nebula Aeterna Productions, although the Bandcamp is also through Nebula. And this is some... I guess I'm just gonna say, like, you know, what's the Flaming Lips thing? Finally, the black metalers are listening to stenchcore, or something like that, or vice versa. But it's heavy chug music with blast beats, and it's kind of medieval, so obviously we like it.
All right, first up, Alchemy of Flesh with Ageless Abominations on Redefining Darkness. So, as I said up front, this is a one-man project from Georgia. Looks like this guy has been in a few other extreme metal projects that I'm not familiar with. Looks like he did a black metal record a couple years back with a project called Lothric. Might have to check that out. It was released on Purity Through Fire, so that's kind of an endorsement. So, this is an unapologetic Morbid Angel worship project. It is stated on the Bandcamp, so I'm not casting aspersions. And as someone who has probably spent like a human year of time listening to Morbid Angel, I am totally okay with more of this sort of thing. But what makes this interesting is, there's a few bands out there that are kind of going back to the well of Tampa death metal. Like, I think it was early this year, or perhaps it was late last year, that we covered the compilation of the Conjureth demos, which is in a large part like Altars of Madness and Blessed Are the Sick era Morbid Angel. And most bands that are heavily influenced by Morbid Angel tend to stick with, like, the first 3 records or so. Like Altars of Madness through Covenant.
I think back in the day, even Covenant, I think, like, the cool Morbid Angel posture back in the day, at least for people who weren't death metal people, was like the first 2 albums are good.
Yeah. Covenant is a little bit more just aggressive and brooding and straightforward. It's
more just of a it's more of a it's more straightforwardly death metal also.
So what makes this record really interesting within that pantheon of Morbid Angel worship is that this is concentrated really heavily on drawing influence from Gateways to Annihilation, which is a record we've touched on the show. It's a great album, and at this point in the greater death metal scene, I think people have basically accepted Formulas Fatal to the Flesh and Gateways as sort of classics, if not on par with the first 3, but close.
No, that's something that's happened recently. I mean, weren't you talking to Numa Hagion about that?
Yeah, because we had picked up on a lot of Gateways influence there, and he admitted it himself that was pretty formative to the idea of Voidgazer, his record. This is very deep into Gateways to Annihilation, with touches of Formulas Fatal to the Flesh, as well as little hints of other Tampa death metal. Monstrosity is mentioned on the page, and I can hear some of that. Hate Eternal, well, Eric Rutan's on guitar there, and he was on guitar in Gateways, so that makes sense. But really, it's concentrated very specifically on that sound, and I don't think I've ever heard that done before. within the context of a band really praying at the altar of Morbid Angel. So I think that's a record that you haven't heard, right?
No, I basically don't know the later Morbid Angel. I guess, yeah, my knowledge of Morbid Angel is... I was thinking, probably of classic death metal bands. I probably know Morbid Angel better than any of them, because for me, a lot of those bands are like one-record bands, right? Where,
gotcha.
I really like Grave, but I just, listened to the first album when it was fast and really stupid, or fast and really brutal, right? They've always
You also tend to know European death metal better than a lot.
Oh, yeah, I know European stuff much better than American. Oh, I guess I like Immolation a lot, but I don't like regularly... that's one of those bands where I should be regularly listening to those albums, and I constantly forget.
Especially because they're pretty close to Morbid Angel a lot of the time.
Yeah, exactly. No, they have the same thing that Morbid... So, yeah, this is a way of getting into this record, right? Immolation and Morbid Angel are a black metal person's favorite death metal bands.
That's true.
Especially of the classic American stuff. Obviously, you can go Swedish and say, Early at the Gates, or you could cheat and say Necrophobic, but that's cheating. Because that's kind of black metal already. Oh, and I guess Bolt Thrower, but as we've talked about, they fall completely off the map, right?
Yeah.
Bolt Thrower is my second or third favorite stenchcore band.
Yeah, I'm curious about your impressions of this without hearing the primary source material, I guess.
Yeah. So, I like the first three Morbid Angel, so I know one more. I also like Covenant. And those are records that have, and I guess I know Blessed Are the Sick pretty well and listened to it recently. This is quite good, and I guess my initial impression of it would be those first two records, and to some extent Covenant, have a black metalish aspect to them, right? Maybe even more overtly than Immolation, because there's just lots of blasting and these kind of neoclassical guitar parts occasionally, right? This is like Morbid Angel without any of the black metal dimension to it. And so you can see why back in the day people were down on these later records or whatever, but at least people who like black metal, but this is fucking cool. I think it was, at times I found it a little bit difficult, but in a good way. This has, the production here is interesting, right? So, Blessed Are the Sick especially has that, to a degree, all the early Morbid Angel, but Blessed Are the Sick, I don't know, you'll have to tell me about the later stuff. But Blessed Are the Sick, right, has this famously dry sound. Which calls direction to pure structure in the guitars and drums. However, the dry sound also has a bit of a hollowed or cryptic or otherworldly sound to it. It's a bit more weird. And this is just, it has the dryness, but but it's also just pretty mid-heavy, I think, and relentlessly loud, and works within a very narrow sonic bandwidth. Is that fair to characterize? I don't know anything about production. Does that sound reasonable?
I would say so. I think that this is definitely punchy. It doesn't have the hollowness of early Morbid Angel.
That's what. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a more solid kind of bassy foundation, but compared to a lot of modern death metal production, yes, this is flatter and drier. It's still very listenable to me, but I was just raised on death metal records that sound like nothing.
I would say, yeah. So I would say it is listenable, but as I got halfway through it, it was sort of at first I was like, "Whoa, this guy's really good. This is heavy and engaging, and sounds like the slower, more the more bludgeoning and or expansive, slow Morbid Angel stuff, and that's cool. But when they went, but halfway through, I was like, okay, is this going to be a thing where I could only really listen to an EP of it plausibly, or half of the record at the time, and just because of it was just different from my version of things that sound really loud, right?
Yeah, I get that.
but by the back end, I was just won over by the sheer skill of the compositions. And there's an interesting way where, through sheer compositional skill, he gets not at the same atmosphere, not at the black metal-y atmosphere, really, of the first few Morbid Angel records, but he gets at a kind of intense atmosphere that I think opens up more on the backside of the record.
Yeah, it's still got that big kind of chthonic feel to it,
Yeah, and I think that emerges more clearly towards the end. And so really the record is more structured around, like, early record bangers and then late record kind of expansive, rigorous composition things, and I think together that works really well.
No, yeah, I get that. Let me play a sample off the second track, one of the early bangers. This is just right off the beginning of House of Earth, the second track, and when we listen to that, I'll tell you a little bit about how this relates to Gateways to Annihilation, and where that sound kind of went in death metal, and just how it relates all together. So right off the bat, it's really impressive just how in Trey Azagthoth's head this guy manages to get in terms of the way he arranges riffs.
Yeah, I mean, if someone told me this was a new Morbid Angel record, it'd be like, wow, they're good again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Some of the trademark things about the way Morbid Angel constructs music are right here. You've got these this really tight right hand work on the guitar. There's a lot of really abrupt transitions between these clipped palm muted phrases and these big kind of liquid tremolo sections. You've got the way they organize riffs is kind of different. There tends to be a lot of odd numbers of repetitions of riffs and then kind of extended bridging fill patterns as it brings it back to like the A riff or something. So he's really gotten inside the compositional technique of that band remarkably well.
Which is especially difficult when the band is like technically demanding and like known for being weird.
Yeah. It's sort of like finding people who can get inside Trey Azagthoth's head is like the equivalent of people who can get inside Sanko's head in black metal. You know, it's that really unique, personal, eccentric guitar style that's so hard to replicate. So, but more importantly, so what Gateways kind of relates to is that in a lot of ways, Gateways to Annihilation is sort of like a proto-behemoth. Because it's still built out of a lot of the same parts, these big kind of Phrygian-style melodies, the abrupt kind of rhythmic changes that build a lot of excitement, this really dramatic kind of commanding vocal performance. But Behemoth takes those elements and simplifies them down to nothing. You know, they become these super bare-bones songs that are carried by production and 30 vocal layers. Now, technically, Behemoth probably got that by touring with Nile one time. But I believe it was Carl Sanders from Nile who was briefly in Morbid Angel when they were up in Tennessee for a little while, way back in the day. That's just like old death metal lore, but it's interesting how these things all link together. But yeah, as far as being able to replicate that style of death metal, a style that's basically been forgotten outside of Morbid Angel, Behemoth, and kind of Vader in a way. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard anyone do this better. I mean, the execution of the conceit is basically flawless.
Yeah, it's quite good. I mean, the right-hand stuff is something I was thinking about, too. The tendency to... This is a thing that not many... hearing it here brings into relief how this is very uncommon in modern death metal. Like, you might hear a slow tremolo riff, right? You might okay, they half time it, and there's a big slow... You know, they might do a big sort of quote-unquote doomy incantation riff.
Yeah.
But hearing... that's all picked slowly.
Yeah.
Hearing forceful full chord picking, like power chord picking, at high speed on a slow or driving mid-tempo part is itself kind of unusual. And, you know, it's just putting... You could play something like that with half the picking speed and fill in all that sonic space, but it wouldn't sound... wouldn't be half as dense or have half the momentum.
Yeah, no,
and his ability to flow between that, as you were saying, his ability to flow between that and the more kind of crisp, chugged, separated off stuff, he's really good at playing between those two. Or like you finish a phrase and then you finish a phrase and then you just release into the trem in a way that's basically a trill.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's informed by this almost kind of neoclassical idea of guitar playing itself. Which is something that was always lurking in the background of Morbid Angel as well as a lot of early Tampa death metal, but it comes out more obviously here than it typically did back then. Because, I mean, another thing that's important about this compared to, like, early Morbid Angel stuff or other people kind of trying to imitate it is the complete absence of thrash.
That's true, and that probably relates to the absence of the things that sound like black metal as well. Yeah. So, for Morbid Angel, by the time they got to Gateways, was that also true, or is Gateways more approximate to thrash?
No, it's definitely true with Gateways. I mean, by the time they get to Formulas, they're a totally transformed band. I mean, they had Steve Tucker on vocals, they brought in Eric Rutan on Gateways. It was a very different kind of vibe once they got there.
So, is there... I mean, so in terms of differences from Gateways... Well, maybe this is apropos of you. Maybe this is appropriate for your next sample. Maybe let's go to your next sample first.
Yeah, sure. So here we'll go to the next track, Slipgates to Annihilation. Half of these songs, possibly all of them, are plays on Morbid Angel song titles or references to like Morbid Angel lore stuff. It's kind of interesting. Slipgates to Annihilation.
You have to buy the special edition to get the bonus track, Professional Drinker.
Yeah. So Slipgates to Annihilation, obviously Gateways to Annihilation, and Slipgates are a reference to Quake, the game, which is a series that Trey Azagthoth's a giant fan of and would talk about all the time back in the day. He was a huge Quake 3 player. So let's listen to Slipgates to Annihilation, and we'll talk about some of the distinguishing features that this guy brings in. So here we can hear some of the stuff that's a little bit more unique to this project that's outside of the Morbid Angel template. A big thing is certain riffs harken back also to Tampa death metal, but stuff more along the lines of early Deicide. Typically, Trey wouldn't do like more straightforward kind of like chromatic stepping when it comes to parts of riffs. You know, on this record, you're going to hear a little bit more of, you know, almost the black metal technique, really, of, you know, these half-step descension or ascensions with the same phrase repeated. You're going to hear some more influence from just, like, the barest trace of European death metal with some of the harmonized leads. And Morbid Angel had some of that, but it's used more extensively here.
Yeah, no, you got a little more of that kind of black metal-y Grieg-sounding thing, the Emperor eeriness on some of the leads.
Yeah, and actually, as dense as this record is, it actually has more breathing room than a lot of even late Morbid Angel. Like on the last sample, you had that sort of atmospheric little two-note wafting guitar passage that was working as a bridge. Here at the very tail end of the sample, that sort of convoluted, almost suffocation-style riff with the more scattered drumming underneath it, that is more unique to this. So it's not just Morbid Angel worship, even though that's a huge part of it. He does have his own voice, and what I appreciate is that he doesn't refuse a good idea just because it doesn't fit the template. You know?
Yeah.
There's ways
that
to
was like
this...
a thing with the Nidstong last week, too. Right? Like, clearly an Ildjarn worship band, but, like, pulling from relevant toolkits.
Exactly, yeah, and you know, I approve of the whole conceit, but if he didn't use some of those ideas outside of the Morbid Angel wheelhouse, it would possibly be even more authentic, but it would not be as good a record, you know. Because the one thing is that these songs do flow very organically, and refusing to let the next necessary riff step in based on its own internal logic, that would have been to the detriment of the record. So I appreciate when he lets it step outside and lets a little bit of his own spirit breathe into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's proven that if he wanted to, he could write just a complete down-the-line worship record, right?
He should just join Morbid Angel, frankly.
Honestly, yeah. How was their last one? What did you think?
Kingdoms Disdained?
Yeah.
I've heard like 2 songs off of it. It's boring.
Just assume it's dumb, yeah, probably.
It's just, I mean, Pete's not in the band anymore, and you know, and it's amazing when Pete left. You suddenly realize, you know, you don't know what you got till it's gone. How important his drumming was, not just in terms of a rhythmic performance, but how it would shape the songs of Morbid Angel, because he had such a unique drum performance, one that's actually replicated pretty well here. Yeah, so, but no, it's not really worth talking about. Morbid Angel ends at Heretic.
Alright, so, yeah, so now we're on my samples. I mean, I think you focused more on the early album bangers, and I suppose my samples focus more on the later parts. So, one reason these songs are cool and are interesting to listen to, like, I mean, in some ways, the whole Morbid Angel conceit is to force you to listen to structure. Like, I learned a lot about music in general by trying to wrap my head around Blessed Are the Sick. Like, this guitar tone's giving me nothing. A lot of these riffs are, in a certain sense, even for a person who is already listening to a ton of black metal, are, like, skronky and weird and unpleasant to listen to. There aren't a lot of racing thrash beats except where they are, and they're very effective, right? It was sort of a and, you know, so learning to understand, like, austerity, like, sort of stark modernist form, or, like, vertical space in music between, you know, leaping up and down and creating riffs that sound like structures, as opposed to sort of, like, horizontal, sort of flowing, propulsive black metal melody. That was all, like, huge for me, learning from Morbid Angel. So, this band is cool in that, especially on this everywhere, but especially on the second part of the album, he really embraces that. And the late there's a version of the main riffs on these songs are all sick, but there's a version of this record that's way more just the main riffs, right? Mm-hmm. More banger oriented, and would still sound a lot like Morbid Angel, right? But this is maybe more Covenant-y in some way. But all these songs have cool shit happening late song, especially towards the second half of the record. So this sample on Knotter of Entrails, a cool title, is going to start and end with the big riff, and the big riff is sick, but what happens in between and how it gets back into the big riff is just as important. Yeah, so you heard it drop back into the main riff there, which is a pretty classic Morbid Angel type riff, right?
Yeah, it's a classic Morbid Angel type riff, but the the drop in that's just so abrupt and it's just so fucking like fist pumping heavy metal. Mm-hmm. That's a more modern touch that I really appreciate because it's just a great moment. Like that was like what I was saying. Never let the conceit get away from doing the cool thing at the right time.
Yeah, that's a good motto. So this is a good example. Like, as we were listening to that, you said this is weird and doesn't sound anything like Morbid Angel, that midsection.
Yeah, I mean, structurally it has tendencies towards it, but there is that sort of brief, almost slam riff, and yeah, Morbid Angel would never do that.
There's this sort of... He does that a number of places on this record. He does a lot of... just embraces making heavy sounds with muted root in a way that is bang. Like, I mean, Morbid Angel would chug the root, but just like banging on it in ways that are more like kind of more physically impulsive, maybe, and maybe a little bit more like certain kinds of hardcore breakdowns, but not directly. But they also have that huge vertical sweep. You know, boom, boom, boom. It's all about like chugging the root, hitting the root as this powerful punctuator, and then sweeping up a very long way, right?
Yeah, because
and that's
because the root note isn't really a note; it's just a noise. It's an impulse.
It bounces. It's all about bouncing between that and the next thing. Exactly, and that's the. That is very Morbid Angel in some way. Not the simplicity, not the treating the root note as a noise and just banging it, but like the shapes of the answering melodies are very Morbid Angel, but they're also the kind of thing that gets troped to death by Behemoth, right?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
You know, like there, that's a Behemoth song.
Yeah, just these very simple Phrygian phrases.
Yeah, so, but like, the cool thing about all that, right, is that also I was counting out the main one of those, and I think it's 7/4. there are a lot of time changes in that.
There's a lot of odd time changes. There's a lot of odd time signatures and a lot of like extended like 2-measure fill passages that'll pop up. It's really structurally labyrinthine music. And, oh, go ahead.
Well, okay, so speaking of that, yeah, labyrinthine is a good way of describing it. Like, it's highly interested in structure, but not in sort of conventional ways. You could call the middle of that song, like, normally we might say that's the developmental part, right? Where, like, you know, it sort of grows and moves, maybe moves towards some sort of climax or a transformation of the song at the end. Or, you know, if it's a black metal song, it gets us towards the big riff you pull out 2/3 of the way through the song, right? Here, it just exists. You know, like I almost call it like, it functions like a breakdown, but it doesn't give you... but it's not like a breakdown. It doesn't give you that kind of release. It keeps everything in pretty sustained texture. The funny thing is, nothing breaks down. Right? You know? And so it's like, okay, if it's not a breakdown, is it a build-up? No, it's not building up to anything. It just happens for a minute or two, and then sort of happens for a minute and a half, and then drops back into the big riff. So, like, there's no, this lack of a sort of growing or organic quality to it is interesting, right? It's less romantic, more kind of modernist, more like building massive cubist or futurist sculptures or whatever.
I think I think that it does still fulfill kind of a similar role to a breakdown, because the climax is the return to the entrance. It's sort of like, directly from Morbid Angel, a song like Fall from Grace, where 2/3 of the way through you get that slow crawling version of the intro riff, that da-da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, and it lingers on that for a long time until the main riff kicks in again. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, you can basically see that sort of structure echoed here.
That's what a great song. Let's just talk about how good that song is. But so I hear that here. So I guess what I mean is very faithful to Morbid Angel in terms of general structural principles, but pretty different in the delivery. Definitely. Yeah, it does work like a breakdown. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing, is it's in a category of thing that, like, it's not... It works like a breakdown. It's physical, it's heavy, it's dramatic, it punctuates the song, but it goes on way longer. There's lots of change and variation within it. Instead of hanging around the root, it's all over the fretboard. And it's just kind of like a forbidding structure that you have to deal with.
Yeah, you got to navigate the maze of torment to get out the other side.
Yes, the 6-dimensional maze of torment, after which you will have escaped the DOI. I think with this joke, I'm going for a level of repetition so extreme that it passes through stale and into genius.
It's working. Keep it going, man.
Thanks. I'm at 3 already. And if this is misinformation about Trey Azagthoth, I apologize, Trey. I don't think you care.
If it's totally wrong, I think that makes the joke better. We're just making up a story about Trey Azagthoth.
An important part of metal is wild lore that has something to do with reality. But yes. Flamma Nera writes, this is the last 3 songs especially. It starts to get kind of more atmospheric, there's only one that in any way gestures towards the BM side of Morbid Angel, which would be Lava Storm, and is a really sick song. But since I'm focusing on weird structural stuff, like, kind of like but since I'm focusing on weird structural stuff here, we're not going to listen to that. Just know that, like, Lava Storm, with a title like that, you'd expect it to rip, and it does. Cool blasting trem riffs. This is the song where I heard it when I started to, like, really respect this record. Right? Not just thinking, like, oh, hey, this is really good and impressive. But, like, when I heard this, I was like, there's, like, art going on here. And ironically, it's because, this one is almost entirely focused on this sort of tortuously spiring structure stuff. And what struck me is that we're going to start on the main riff, and then it's going to throw us into a straight-up annoying riff. And when I heard that, I was like, God, this is annoying. Am I going to have to skip? And then, like, of course, he finds a way to justify it. And then the song would be completely incomplete without that.
Oh man, I really like that one a lot, actually.
Well, so there you go. The point is, it stands out, right?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, though. It is one of those really idiosyncratic kind of riffs that needs something after it to put it into context.
Yeah, no, like, and honestly, like, if you, with this particular guitar tone, sliding up, in this particular production, sliding up there has kind of a, unless you're just really, really into Morbid Angel sounds, and I'm into Morbid Angel sounds, right? Mm-hmm. But, like, that will have, it has this kind of, it's a bit queasy, and might sound, and has a kind of uncomfortably piercing tone to it. And the riff just sort of lurches and slides down and then loops back up and really lingers over the most unpleasant intervals, but not in the kind of like, bang your heads, motherfucker, this is a grave song kind of way. Like it's not like hitting a discharge, like a discharge tritone or something, right? It's not like crushing dissonance. It's this kind of needling or anxiety-inducing dissonance.
Yeah, it's coming from really aggressive 60s and 70s guitar music kind of ideas.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, well, it kind of lingers up there, point being, and it sort of hints at descending a number of times. It just goes back up, and the fact that he repeats it 4 times makes you think, it's like, this riff is important. And I was kind of like, okay, well, I hope this isn't what the song is about. But then sort of the way it throws out of that into one of the most sort of conservative, virtually Morbid Angel, is that the next riff is basically a quote, right?
I think it might be, yeah.
It's very close to a quote. It might be something off Covenant. But it just, it's very cool. I don't know. Like, then I look back on that. As soon as he justifies that riff, I'm like, oh, that was cool. And then it produces atmosphere, right? That riff sort of sounds like one of these
Well, I think that's a good point, which is that this band and Morbid Angel both generate their atmosphere pretty much purely from structure, which is something that's basically forgotten, because now the word atmosphere is so poisoned.
It is, really, yeah.
By so much shit. People don't realize that it's like, atmosphere isn't necessarily about keyboards or delay or guitar tone or production style. You can generate it through pure arrangement. I mean, that's how classical music worked for many, many years.
and in terms of anything that is and the thing is, this band strips away, like, Morbid Angel had a little more beyond that, right? It had these it was like a bone dryness. It was almost a sort of
it's got that cryptic undead quality.
Yeah, or the rasping or demonic dryness. It had there was a kind of mystery and power built into the tone and the way it kind of hung back a little bit on Blessed Are the Sick or whatever. Or there's, or the rawness on Altars or whatever, right? And there were hints of glorious consonant melody throughout, cropping up in ways that, like, straight up influenced a lot of second wave stuff, I think. Whereas, like, this just doesn't have any of those proto-black metalisms or black metal adjacencies. It just, it generates it purely, like, the guitar tone, instead of being sort of, kind of, eerily above the world, the guitar tone is just like, hello, I'm in your ear! And the atmosphere is, generated entirely despite that. Right, like, it just, like, in some ways this is mixed and written in the least quote unquote atmospheric way possible, and yet by the end of the record, you really start to kind of see the territories he's envisioning.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
Hey, and welcome back. So after that album of advanced Morbid Angel worship, we are back with Connected's The Degeneration, an independent release currently available on the internet. Also, worth noting. You know how you were talking about finding a lot of stuff on that new wave of old school heavy metal or whatever. Or new wave of traditional heavy metal. Yeah. So I think this is a brother channel called New Wave of Old School Thrash Metal. Mm-hmm. And I found this on there. This is a YouTube find. These are... so did you do any research on the band?
Not much. I mean, I took a look at them on Metal Archives and stuff, but that was about it.
They are, as far as I can tell, they are young dudes.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Jesus Christ.
Teenagers, yeah.
Are these guys in middle school? Holy fuck.
I mean, maybe not that far off, right? But it's Finland, so it's in the water.
Yeah.
And, and the funny thing is, okay, so this instantly gives them an interesting perspective. I know there's also some Swedish death metal band coming out of very young dudes where I think it's literally the kid of one of the guys from Entombed. Of, like, the best guy from Entombed. I think Damien was talking about this in that, when we were rambling in that interview, but this is it's entirely possible, that one of them has a dad in Demigod or something, right? But it's not part of their press at all or anything like that, right? They're not. If that's just wild speculation. And the point is, they're just a band of kids playing death metal, and the interesting thing is now that's somehow anomalous, but if we dialed it back to 1990, the formative Scandinavian death metal albums were being made by people that age, right? Mm-hmm. And black metal records were being made by people that age a couple years later. So it is it gives them right away. That gives them a way of being adjacent to the kind of thing they're interested in. Sort of writing from adjacent to the origin rather than having this kind of referential and reverential relationship to it. and there might be something to the point that just like a certain kind of go for the guttural European death metal just needs to be written by teenagers. So like Alchemy of Flesh. I forgot to say this, but the press for Alchemy of Flesh said death metal for death metal's sake. Mm-hmm. That's also what's going on here, but it's a very, very different kind of death metal. You could even call it death thrash, but only in this weird eccentric sense of the term that's different from, but kind of like, that Finnish band Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
Where they said they played death thrash, but they kind of just sounded like a metal punk band, right? And like this band, it's kind of death thrash, okay, but it doesn't at all sound like the raw, raw noisy death thrash we're familiar with. There is thrash metal, there's death metal structured a lot like thrash metal. And what this really seems like is a meticulous effort to recreate a confluence of death metal, thrash metal, and I would say probably like half thrash in the very early 90s. I've got to take a kettle off the stove. You keep talking. All right, I'm back.
Okay.
Hope I didn't miss anything interesting.
No. It was thrilling. So, the half thrashism thing I thought was interesting because I picked up on that, but it was also one of those things where you're bouncing back and forth, and even at the same time, it's like it's still kind of a dirty word. So it's like I really like this record, so I don't want to call it that, but. It's
itself a euphemism for an even dirtier word that we won't say.
Oh, groove metal.
Oh, he said it.
Well, it's interesting though because I was actually a quick detour. I was at a local show around here. I was just trying to get out of the house, because I'm working from home. Bunch of terrible bands, but then a band came on, a three-piece of older guys, probably 40s or 50s. Who played a super tight, really killer set of kind of early 90s half thrash. I mean, the thrash metal was still distinctly in there, but you had all these just choppy, palm-muted chug rhythms in, the old Machine Head style, but faster and more technically played, and, I mean, they fucking killed. And I was like, oh, there is juice in that style. It just depends on how you implement it.
Oh, for sure. And, as we've talked about it, it turns out that a lot of certain things we thought were innovations that happened within metalcore or metallic hardcore actually happened in groove first.
Yeah, wow, the time. I mean, everyone forgets that Cowboys from Hell by Pantera was in fucking 1990.
Yeah. So so this is kind of a concept that I've heard. I'm unfortunately going to forget the name of this band, even though I think the dude follows us on Instagram. But there's a sort of like a hardcore death metal band, like as in death metal from hardcore scene, played in a hardcore way. I think from the Midwest, maybe from Detroit, where they're tapping into this kind of idea of a time when you could see, Deicide and Pantera on the same bill, whatever, right? And this seems to be kind of a similar idea. And there's even a rather mannered thing going on with the cover art, in the same way that you get certain raw BM people meticulously recreating, the original Xeroxed LLN covers or whatever. Interestingly, this is in a way more ballsy. This appears to be an effort to recreate a mainstream death metal cover from 1992.
Oh,
right?
I'd say it's even like 95, 96.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. No, 90. Yeah, that seems right. Yeah,
it's just like it's a deliberately bad cover.
Very deliberately bad. Yeah, we've got a sort of semi-color X-ray of a skeleton. We've got the logo. The band logo is fine. It looks kind of like the Morbid logo. And we've got a parental advisory sticker added for no reason, except homage to this moment. So they really want it...
It's totally deliberate.
Yeah, so they really want it to look like something you could have found in Tower Records, and to sound like something you could have found in Tower Records, which is they almost have an uncannily good sense for, I mean, we're just old enough to be able to remember that era of music, and I wasn't listening to death metal then, right? Mm-hmm. Far from it. I mean, I'm not sure I was even listening to punk at that point. But, like, we have a memory of how things like that worked, vaguely. It's sort of uncannily accurate here.
Yeah, it's designed, it's a record that wants to be a gem from the cutout bin.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, like, I mean, I think in future it might be good for them to like get a repress of this, or a second edition of this that has a different cover, and just embrace the fact that they've got their own thing going on, because as we get into the samples, I think it will become clear there's really nothing dated about this style, and certainly I don't think anybody in the early 90s was doing something exactly like this, right?
Yeah, no, there's things that were kind of like this, but this is one of those kind of simulacrum things,
mm-hmm.
where it's this is based off of like these young guys' thoughts of what this would have been like in the early to mid 90s.
Yeah,
which means that they get a lot of it right, but it's also unique because they weren't there for it. So they're viewing it from this completely different context.
Yeah, it's the game of telephone, which is sometimes leads to horrible misunderstandings and inauthenticity, but here leads to something pretty cool and interesting, and just as you said, up front about the groove metal thing, just reviving a nexus of things that were seen as connected back in the day that are no longer seen as connected, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of tapping into tapping into possibilities that are still there, right? So, take it away with your sample, dude.
Yeah. So, right up front, beginning of the album. I also love how like half the songs on this are like tough guy thrash song titles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I bet a big one for these guys is Violence.
I was going to say
Slaughter in the Vatican.
What about Demolition Hammer? Oh no, Slaughter in the Vatican is Exorder.
Oh shit, yeah, that is Exorder.
Yeah, which is epitome half thrash. But yeah, probably Demolition. The first band I thought of when I heard this was Demolition Hammer.
Yeah, well, let's listen to we're going to listen to the opening track. It's called We Owe You Nothing, right from the beginning. And this, I love it when a band makes an album really easy to talk about, because there's three things that happen on this record. You've got straight death metal parts, you've got straight thrash or half thrash parts, and then you've got some kind of melodeath stuff. And you're going to hear all of those lined up, riff A, B, C, and then it's going to kick back to the original. And it's like, wow, there we go. We've got all the ingredients in the first 2 minutes, and it primes you for the whole album. So yeah, it's lined up in this perfect sequence. Opening sample, big death metal riff with the double kicks, just to start things off, then rip into this pretty straightforward thrash section, little melodic bridging riff, then full-fledged melodeath riff before we kick back into the A riff, but now with some rhythmic variation that starts to show off the kind of connective tissue between the death metal and the groove ideas. This is really, really smart songwriting across this whole album. And something you're going to hear a lot is these guys don't do A-B variations, but they will do sequences of like ABC back into usually a rhythmically varied ABC arrangement. And all the parts are really solid. That's the thing that's really remarkable about it, is there's a lot of, especially the thrashy stuff on this record, typically I would not like at all. I mean, we all know my feelings about thrash in general. However, this band's sense of pacing and how they hang these parts together is it's outstanding.
The thing you're hearing is sort of U.S. thrash, right? That would be the first dun 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 dun. That could also be a slowed down Sweet Death riff. Like
yeah, that's true.
It's a little more melodic, but like it struck, you know thrash metal better than, because, you're the long hair here. You know thrash metal better than I do. So there's probably, but in terms of having a slightly dark, Mordorian feel to it, and being sort of heavy chugged in this groovy D-beaty way, it'd be a little like you took the standard Dismember or Entombed riff and slowed it down and made it less show-offy, and made the parts of it more distinct. So the way they play, regardless throughout this, like the way they play, whether you think of that as thrash or as a Swedish death metal riff or whatever, the way they play the sort of more Sunlight Studios type sounding stuff that crops up here throughout is, not your standard Entombed clone for sure. And when they're doing the big flamboyant lead stuff, there's lots of Dismember here, right? And also just the way they groove on that kind of thrashing riff sounds way more like Death Breath than it does Entombed. Death Breath being the sort of latter day, very early OSDM, like back when it was a good idea in like 2008, right? By like literally Nick Anderson from Entombed. And my contra opinion is that Death Breath is better. So point being, these guys tap a lot of the, you've convinced me over the years that the Sweet Death formula is pretty limited, right? But, and often not that great. But, like, Death Breath taps into everything that's, like, cool about it. And this band, I think, does so as well.
Yeah, and part of it has to do with focusing on, the kind of tendons and sinews between these different styles. Because there's ways to do there's a few ways to go about it. You could go this very lowest common denominator thing where you're only taking the common elements of all these styles and you're just mashing it into this single massive sound, which is like doable, but it's boring. And I think when that happens, you get boring old school Sweet Death stuff. And you can try to do like a modern, like galvanized thing, and then you get something kind of like Skeleton Witch, which appeals to some people, but definitely not me. But when you start focusing on stuff like, okay, so where's the connection between the kind of groovy stuff and the death metal? Oh, well, we can get that by just playing around with rhythmic variations under the riffs. Or what's the connective tissue between the more Sweet Death stuff and the more melodic stuff? Well, we access Dismember, who are like kind of the skeleton key between what would be Gothenburg Melodeath and like Stockholm Death. So I think there's, consciously or not, this great inherent sense of songwriting where they detect the through lines between these things and develop them in really interesting ways and just play around with arrangement in ways that are really compelling. I mean, none of these ideas are new ideas, but the way they're presented and the way they're executed is really smart. and really engaging.
They're also woven together by a sense of, what we on the show might call pop, but what we really mean is just heavy metal that people can bang their heads to. Songwriting, right? Like, they're short songs. They are extremely catchy, right? There are vocal hooks written into the music in a way that is extremely uncommon in death metal today, right?
Yeah.
Like the vocals over that thrashy, sweet earthy part were like really catchy and a hook in themselves. And the way these songs move is, it's informed. They understand certain kinds of conventions about generating hooks and catchy effects that you would really only expect in a more veteran band.
Yeah, it's wise beyond its years, and you can tell these guys are very talented musicians, but they know when to step on the flash button and when to let off of it. They're capable of a lot, but you only see them at their max capability maybe once per song. Maybe not even that, maybe once every other song. So what you get as a result is this very well-rounded piece of music that never strays too far into any one niche. And when you've been listening to metal as long as we have, it's often you get jaded, you get kind of tired of playing it safe, but if you really know how to write a fucking song like these guys do, it doesn't matter. You can make it out of whatever pieces you want.
That's the ballsy statement about this. Like, they're like an underground band of teenagers literally trying to make something that would have probably sold like 100,000 copies in 95.
Yeah, definitely. So, should we go to your sample, or should I do my second?
I would do yours, because I think you got the sort of basic aggressive ripping sound template, and we might as well go through that, and then mine focus on some weirder aspects of it.
Okay. So I'm going to go a little bit further in the album. This is off a track called Bitter End. And one thing I forgot to mention, it'll probably pop up more on your samples. The closest comparison I can make with this band is The Crown, who I think you like also, right?
I feel positively about them, but I always forget to listen to them. But yeah, Death Race King is cool.
Yeah, I really like The Crown, and I also really like their old stuff under Crown of Thorns, their first couple albums. Those are amazing melodeath records that everyone should listen to. So that's not going to apply so much here, but I just wanted to bring it up as an aside. That's the closest comparison. This is like a meaner, kind of raw version of The Crown in a lot of ways. So this track, Bitter End, the opening riff you're going to hear is very Crown of Thorns, but then you're going to hear some very straightforward kind of Bay Area thrash stuff. But what you should pay attention to is, compared to the actual thrash songs that they're kind of pulling these ideas from, they're playing those riffs half as long, and they're playing with the rhythms under them a lot more. So you don't get into that sort of looping thrash pattern where it never really goes anywhere. It always feels like it's moving towards a target, and then they start playing around, breaking it up with solos and melodeath ideas, and you start to get something really special. Oh, I think I heard him say the fuck word. Maybe we do need that parental advisory sticker.
Dude, actually bothering to swear, like, I mean, swearing isn't really done in, like, cool death metal, or even black metal at this point, because it does kind of break the... If you're going for something that has, like, a serious, I don't know, pagan or fantasy or death metal-y kind of cosmic horror thing.
Yeah.
It sort of breaks the flow of it. It's this kind of very first-person thing to go like, fuck. But, like, in this, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, you're doing tough... This is tough guy music. And that's cool. So, again, kind of like the first sample I played, what you're hearing here is another sort of ABC kind of thing. Well, here it's kind of like an ABCB ABC sort of arrangement, but whatever, you get the idea. It's basically three parts that are interacting with each other. So you have the opening kind of, I described it as like a very Crown of Thorns kind of riff up front, which you were pointing out, it's also very dissection. It can be a lot of things. It can come from that whole melodic Swedish Black Death thing, yeah.
Yeah, this is as close as it gets to drawing on black metal, but from thoroughly within dissection as a death metal band.
Yeah.
Right?
So you've got that, and then you've got the sequencing of those two thrash riffs. And it's very straightforward at first. Then they break out the second, more aggressive kind of double-time thrash riff, which is cool. And then they amp it up again by throwing a blast beat under it.
Dude, so that, I'm saying even that sounds like dissection. Rhythmically, the sort of like fast feathered picking and sort of like chord change, like sort of riffy chord change writing is really like, structurally like things on Storm of the Light's Bane. It's just colored in a more down the line heavy power chord death metal kind of way, which I think is really smart and cool.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And then we start hitting these like little sequences of different melodeath ideas, which they can be melodeath, they can be kind of the Swedish melodic black death thing, they could be like old Cradle of Filth, like lead lines, actually. It can be from any number of places. What's interesting about this record is so much of the material on it is built out of just like very simple, like primordial ideas that everyone has used to the point where they've almost discounted them. But through slight modifications and a good ear, you're like, yeah, that's why we're still doing this 30 years later. It's still a good idea. Let's keep fucking playing these kinds of riffs.
Yeah, no, this is pretty, yeah, I mean, that part is great. I mean, the other thing that all the sort of, the doing black metal-y things within a death metal framework and playing with these kind of more melancholy, glorious sounding European lines without really cloning the old European stuff is, of course, another thing that their countrymen, Sepulchral Curse, do very well. Like, that's kind of what I was thinking throughout this sample. Like, what another band that might traverse similar territory very quickly would be Sepulchral Curse. Not the thrashy break. Well, actually, they have versions of that, don't they? They have, like sort of stompy, tritony stuff where you'll get the screaming backing vocals and shit.
Yeah, it would not be as clearly kind of Bay Area as a lot of this stuff is, but the idea would be there.
Yeah, similar. I mean, basically, Sepulchral Curse is a band doing more highbrow death metal with a similar kind of command of all the constituent parts. And yeah, no, I mean, this is great, right? I have nothing much else to say except that. Yeah,
let's get to. Yeah. Well, let's get to your side of things, because you're quoting some of the weirder parts of this record, I think.
Yeah, so these parts are all the sort of more overtly, I mean, when people are thinking like, the parts that more overtly resonate with groove metal senses of pacing. But interestingly, the more closely I listened to this, the more I heard them connecting to various kinds of other stuff that we talk about more on this show. So this track, Trail of Lies, this is again their sort of mastery of pop heavy metal songwriting conventions that have disappeared as something that, ironically, the bands that imitate this imitate old school death metal would do better if they were more attentive to certain kinds of pop conventions, right? So here, like throughout the record, right, here's a risky move that they somehow pull off, which is this track is like almost like the ballad.
All right.
And it starts with this kind of sullen noir blues vibe. But this is from later on the track, so this is Trail of Lies. Okay, so yeah, we fade out on something that's like pretty like an ever-flowing stream, right? You get those kind of swarming downward harmonized leads, right? But in the middle of that, right, we're just doing the thing that became like illegal to do in extreme metal in the last like 20 years, which is just going like right? Which is obviously one of the most intuitively cool things you can do with a metal guitar, but for some reason is not allowed, right? Which we'll get to with Wyrtgurn later. So you could hear that and you could go, they're doing that and they're kind of spicing it up with these kind of like greasy minor key blues ideas that, and so like when you hear that you could be like, oh, this is the Pantera. This is like kind of Pantera-y, right?
Yeah, I think the most direct reference here, like listening to that again, I didn't really pick up on it the first time. I think this track as a whole is supposed to be a play on Seasons in the Abyss by Slayer.
I was thinking of that too at some point during this record, possibly here.
Yeah, because it's like they're playing with like kind of modified quotes from like a few different songs off that.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's almost, yeah. So maybe they're doing that. Okay, I'm going to save my deep cut reference for the next one, which I think sounds more like it. Actually, yeah, the next one is a better sample of this. So, okay, let's just say, all right, playing around with Season of the Abyss type stuff. Again, not a record that is has a lot of currency in terms of immediate influence on modern death metal.
But it would have been huge for people who were playing death metal in like 95, 96.
Yes, I think it's more popular with hardcore people now, but for obvious reasons.
It's weird. Hardcore people are into weird Slayer.
Yeah, Seasons, I could never actually get... I loved the idea of Slayer doing a heavy kind of mid-tempo album, but I could never really get into it.
No, I was never a big fan of that one. I mean, South of Heaven is kind of like the same idea, but better. So.
Oh, maybe I'm even... I'm not sure I've even fucking listened to Seasons. I might have been talking about South of Heaven. Yeah, it's, But they got... By that point, they started quoting Slayer riffs. Like Slayer themselves did. And so...
they started imitating
on South of Heaven, you just get, okay, what if we have all these songs chugged out, and then, like, throw the Slayer riff in at the end.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would probably matter less to me now. When you're younger, you can't make minute distinctions between these things, right? So I checked this out. I would have listened to that years ago. But as far as these guys, right? So they're doing this self-consciously. They're like, hey, let's bite this Slayer riff but move it around a little bit to make it this slinky little kind of arpeggiated flourish in this kind of chug passage.
Yeah, and they still use the same sort of half-thrash chug passage in the middle that was so common to so many of those bands back then, but like you said, no one's fucking used it in 20 years outside of little bar bands,
Yeah. You know what? Ironically, it would have been, these guys are more self-conscious about their use of Slayer riffs than Slayer was.
They're doing it more tastefully.
They're doing it in better faith. So we get to, here's the last sample. Here's where it gets, I think, a little more deep cut-ish, which is Against the Prophecies. Oh, and just the other thing, I mean, I guess you heard it, right? But, like, that whole track, just the whole mood there, which is almost like murder mystery, or waiting for the bus in Helsinki in the rain, or trying to do a handshake drug deal on the streets in Helsinki in the rain. It's all got this kind of, It shouldn't work, but it does. Do you remember those god-awful bluesy moments on the last Incantation record that they put out?
Oh, God, don't fucking remind me.
Yeah, so this is like the good version of that. Like, somehow this track should be the most awkward on the record, but somehow they nail it, and it, like, stands out.
The pentatonic scale is a wily and dangerous creature. It's like trying to catch a crocodile,
All right, so we'll go to Against the Prophecies, and we'll just listen, especially for the last couple riffs in this sequence. But let's jam on some chugs. So we end there on this kind of, try to get to what that is in a sec. This sort of like a pile-up gang vocal, tough guy chorus. But the two riffs before that are fascinating. The riff right before it, right, this kind of just, you could hear that as a half-thrash riff, but what it really is bolt thrower, especially early bolt thrower. Mm-hmm. Formally, like it's an In Battle There Is No Law riff. But it's embellished with this really unusual, this thing that is coloring outside the lines of what a bolt thrower riff has been codified, which is that, that sort of like kind of epic sounding, glistening arpeggio turnaround. And the earlier riff...
At the end of the string of zeros.
Exactly. No, zeros and tritones. And then finally... And then, before that, the earlier stream of zeros riff also has these kind of epic-colored minor scale, open minor scale arpeggios creeping in there.
That's like a Fourth Crusade kind of thing.
There's just like it's like a two-note flourish in the previous riff.
Oh, that one.
Yeah. No, that yeah, that's for sure is bolt thrower. But basically, our listeners will be able to hear, right? There's play in these between sort of dissonant, dissonant minor, dissonant Eastern scale minor, Slayer and Slayer bolt thrower type riffing, with stuff that sounds tonally more like a post-punk riff.
Mm-hmm. Right? I can kind of get that, yeah.
And there's one band that does that, which is Armored Angel. And I think a lot of shit on this record could actually be bolt throwery, and a lot of moments like this, or like the sort of more brooding kind of moment in that Trail of Lies track, are really kind of influenced by Armored Angel, which is this, we talk about them occasionally on the show, they're this sort of Australian, technically speaking, death metal band, or I just think that classification should be changed, right? Nobody's thought about it in 20 years, but
yeah.
Like,
Armored Angel is not anything in particular. It really is its own thing.
Yeah, like we were talking about last time, Australian extreme metal kind of was its own genre before the mid-90s, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Armored Angel is kind of in a group on their own, but they're like a band that is primarily influenced by Bolt Thrower and The Killing Joke and has the atmosphere of like early Mystic black metal, like Rotting Christ or something. Very unique band with focus on these hypnotic mid-tempo grooves, but a lot of what Armored Angel does is these riffs that you're not allowed to play anymore, right? You know, like and this, you know, if anything, these young dudes throw a lot more flourishes in the riffs like that, but they're doing a similar thing, and given how much they're drawing for, I have a hard time believing that's not kind of a reference point here. And yeah, and I mean, you know. Yeah.
I mean, really, you can kind of just toss it up in the air, because there's, like, for instance, another thing, it wasn't super obvious on any of the samples, except maybe one or two parts, but Old Sepultura around Arise is a huge thing here. Mm-hmm. Like I was thinking Desperate Cry in particular. Desperate Cry, that track has... They quote, like, the chorus riff a couple times across this record, and it's awesome.
What about, like, so a band I know jack shit about is Carcass.
Okay.
Like, this, I'm told that Carcass eventually recorded an album of poppy death metal that was melodic but not mellow death. Is this true?
Oh, I mean, that's a whole conversation in and of itself.
About Heartwork, yeah.
Yeah, Heartwork is just such a weird thing, because it's kind of before Gothenburg gets fully established, but they do have Michael Ammett on guitar for that one, who ends up becoming a huge part of that scene. Mm-hmm. It's definitely unique. I don't really like it, but it's very worth listening to, because nothing really sounded like it at the time. But it also doesn't sound like Gothenburg. It's really kind of its own thing.
All right. Well, any concluding thoughts? I mean, basically, I think we like this, right?
Yeah, I really like it. I mean, bring back the stupid riff. right, we're back, and it's time to just ruin everybody's day. Yeah, our tumorous third slot, almost exclusively reserved for brutal death at this point.
Beware her tumorous third slot.
Ooh, God.
Can we even include that on the show anymore?
I'm pretty sure some of those are depicted on the cover of this album.
So yeah, this is the brutal death, so we're leaving that in.
Yeah. All right. So, Cerebral Effusion, Ominous Flesh Discipline. Cerebral Effusion has been around for a pretty long time. Let me pull it up just to make sure. But so yeah, since '97, and they took a while to get going. They did a couple records in the 2000s, which it seems like just not a lot of people have heard, and then they really kind of took off with their 2010 record, Impulsive Psychopathic Acts. And to describe Cerebral Effusion, this is probably the single most brutal death metal for brutal death people we've ever had on the show. We've had stuff that is at least like kind of aesthetically interesting, something like Induced, or a lot of the Ortega projects are like that. Actually, Cerebral Effusion was an Ortega project back in the day, but I think he left after the first EP. Mm-hmm. You've got stuff where there's some more obvious kind of hooks, like Oncology or Metharoma or something like that. But this is just a fucking brick wall of brutal death. And I've kind of figured out the position on the show to take with this stuff, which is brutal death people don't listen to the show. I mean, we've covered a lot of it, but the brutal death scene is its own thing. Like, the bands and the labels find it interesting when I bring these things on, but really what I'm doing is presenting brutal death people to people who don't really listen to it. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there's a lot of black metal people, especially like on our Discord and stuff, who have really started to get more interested in it. So I guess I'm providing like guided tours of the brutal death scene for people outside of it. And I guess the easiest way to describe this is, for those in the know, this is most comparable to the sort of thing that was coming out of like United Guttural Records in the late 90s, early 2000s. Imagine a very pure successor to the Suffocation style, taken to its natural conclusion. Just faster.
Yeah, but like without the death metal.
Kinda, yeah. It's like, it's hard to...
Suffocation is recognizably a death metal band that has like riffs and sounds kind of like hardcore too. And this purely just sounds like the parts of Suffocation that became Slam and Brutal Death, right?
Yeah, it does. There's something so aggressively unapproachable about this music. Like, it has some of the flattest production in the world. Like, it's deliberately sapped of tonal dimension. It's bone dry. It's just incredibly challenging to listen to. And honestly, it's like I have to make an effort to explain how this is still music to a lot of people, I think. So what was your take on it? We basically know, but for the record,
this is, I mean, I think my earnest take on this is that it's really funny. And, you know, I've avoided saying that about most Brutal Death you brought on, because the whole thing has been me and, you know, you introducing me to the ins and outs of listening to Brutal Death. And as we've talked about, you've sold me on a lot of things. Even if I'm not going to go back and listen to it, I'm like, this is cool, right? So in terms of something equally uncompromising, right, the Exterminated is like, never going to listen to that again. But that is an impressive, powerful aesthetic experience. Right.
Yeah, I've listened to that one like 10 times since that episode.
Yeah. This is, and there's stuff I like, you know, just, there's stuff that's less accessible to me. Like, I don't know, who was that Greek band, the slam band, who did Flamethrower Ecdysis?
Oh, Embryectomy, yeah.
Yeah, I can't get into that shit, right? But, like, you know, I can, slam with that kind of sterile production, I just can't do. This I've heard things that I've liked less than this. This is obviously objectively good in terms of how completely committed it is to its core principles, right? But it just reminds me of, like, it reduces me to that cliche of, like, haha, brutal death metal funny, because it sounds to me now how ludicrous all this shit sounded to me in high school, right? When I, like...
Yeah.
We were talking in the bonus episode about how, like, the best... Like, my introduction to extreme metal was, like, grindcore and brutal death on this late night college radio show, and, like, the best of it sounded like that Devourment record, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, you know, stuff that was harder for me to get into sounded like this. Now, I feel like now, right, in some ways, I'm in on the joke, and I can appreciate this, right? One significant advantage it has over certain of the more excessive stuff from that period, or I guess wrong kind of excessive, is the stuff from that period that had a deliberately sterile production was infamously clicky, right? Like the blast beats sounded like clicks, the guitar tone was tinny. This is not clicky. The snare hits and are listenable. The endless palm mutes actually have some body to them. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's more. It's kind of more listenable than you might expect. But it's just after a thing that's completely different from what I seek in music, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so, as far as the exterminated thing, like, you put that in the notes, and I could certainly hear the parallel, right, in terms of how uncompromising they are. Like, it's the same basic template, right, which is, I hope you like endless 16th note multi-chugs, bro.
Yes.
And, you know, sometimes a slam, right? Just the riffs are composed out of 16th note chugs, and they go all over the place, and then there's a slam. But where Exterminated has this sort of, like, disgusting, thick, viscous mudslide tone, or blood slide tone, right? And it's kind of raw and energetic and unhinged. This is just, this is the same formal ideas with the same kind of, like, remorseless commitment to these two things, but done with this much more reserved mechanical production. So, you know, it was honestly hard for me to make myself keep listening to this, but while I was listening to it, I could enjoy it.
Yeah, I get that. Well, let's just go with your sample. Let's just show the people what this sounds like.
Okay, well, the first one I start is less representative, so let's go with Delirious Urges.
Okay.
So this is so the fast parts on the record, often on a brutal death record, on the Oscar Ortega stuff, right? Or, like, it's often the fast parts that I can get most into, right? Like, okay, there's a cool unhinged Syrian tremolo riff, and, like, it's sort of like ricocheting off more power chordy stuff in this wild way, right? On this record, I cannot get my hooks in the fast parts at all, and it is, ironically, I prefer the slams. But on Delirious Urges, this is a fast part that I can get into, because I think I can hear what's going on here. And when I was listening to this, I perked up. This was exciting.
I get the whole thing where it's funny. It's a fucking ludicrous premise for music, you know?
Yeah, well, and we've talked about how, like, on a lot of the Ortega records or whatever, they're kind of like musical jokes thrown in, right? Or,
yeah.
Or on, Defeated Sanity, right? There's like this play going on. That is very uppermost on this part. Like, as you were saying at the beginning, hey, that's almost a riff, right? And, of course, they introduce the riff with a slam. And then they start sort of ramping it up a bit, like, over this sort of stuttering blasts. And then there's just, like, a rim shot, and they start, like, the drummer just goes ape shit, right? And they start, like, blasting. They take that basic phrase and start, like, throwing it all over the place as the drummer just goes nuts. And you can really hear, I would be hard-pressed to describe what happens here, right? But it very methodically sounds like pots and pans falling down the stairs in a very satisfying way. And it's in moments like this where all I can latch onto is the interplay between the instruments. Like, all I can latch onto is, like, the cool way the drummer is, like, stuttering and playing behind the guitar, or, like, the racing ahead of it then, or the smart change-ups, or the way the different sections kind of ricochet off each other. It's when all I can latch onto is this. What you've said about the jazziness of brutal death metal really stands out. Outside of Defeated Sanity, where it's obvious, right? But, like, you've said that in terms of its format, brutal death metal is very jazzy, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, like, these changing combos of people. Well, on this, in parts like this, even in stuff that's sort of conspicuously and deliberately unmusical, there is a lot of jazziness to the exciting things going on. Because, again, it connects back to that Morbid Angel thing in a way. Like, here's another way in which you're only listening to structure.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think really what you're getting at is what makes this... Like, even... Yeah, I was listening to this record again this morning, and,
Just with your morning coffee.
Wilkins
the cat brings you the newspaper in his mouth. You pound a 16. You put on your gym shorts and you pound a 16-ounce Red Bull while listening to Cerebral Effusion.
You have no idea how close that is to my actual morning ritual.
I think I think we're so good at making fun of each other it approaches the truth.
Yeah, no, you really are pretty close, but I think that this is one that's growing on me the more that I listen to it, because it's such a fucking insane conceit structurally. I've said this for other records, but I don't know if it's ever been more apropos than on this one, that this is something that that really rewards super close, intense, focused listening.
Yeah.
And definitely that's gonna be a struggle for anyone who hasn't been listening to this kind of thing half their life. I mean, this is difficult for me because it's so flat. I was even thinking, listening to this, it's like we call this stuff brutal death metal, but in a sense it's not even brutal, it's just alien.
That's why I always hated this stuff back in the day. Because in the era of clickiness or whatever, right, that shit was just obviously not heavy or aggressive. And especially, I think, there were the more tech... I don't think I could tell back then the difference between tech death and brutal death, right? So, there was this... maybe some of the stuff I was thinking of that way was more tech death. But, like, there was a bad way in which that stuff was not even brutal. But here I get it. Right? It's not exactly brutal. It's just very rigorous and very uninterested in what you feel about it.
It's like...
And, it's like, you can listen to it because, like, you actually sort of like sounds like this. Whereas for me, it's just like, if you gave me an album as rigorously structured and sort of intellectual as this is in a weird way, with different sound palette, I'd probably be able to hear it completely differently.
I can see that. I kind of appreciate the fact that, like, there's a serious argument to be made that if you're sophisticated enough instrumentally listening to this record, you could probably just, like, read the sheet music to this album and have basically the same result as actually listening to it. Because it's so flattened out, it's so uninterested in conventional heavy metal kicks or, like, enthusiastic moments. There aren't really peaks or valleys. It's just this flat line of intense rigor in the manner, like, I guess here's something that people could access, in the manner of extremely rigorous, like, minimal black metal in a way. There's just a lot more going on. But
it's kind of like Ildjarn, right? But
yeah, it is.
But it's after the opposite thing, where Ildjarn you have to sort of engage with it emotionally and physically, whereas this is like you have to engage with it cerebrally.
Yeah. So, well, actually, I'll play a sample. Here's a good example of where you get tremendously more value the closer you listen to it. And a lot of this does hinge on details of the drum performance. This is a fucking ridiculous drum performance all across this record. So let's listen to Compelling the Epidemic.
Just a CDC public reminder that if you are interested in information on COVID-19, you can find official sources linked in our description.
Yeah, I'll put those right in there, Chief. Okay, so Compelling the Epidemic. Let's just listen to. I've just got like a 90-second sample off this, but try just as an exercise, just really for 90 seconds focusing in and trying to pick up every note. You know what I mean? So I think maybe one of the Rosetta Stones to listening to this is the fast parts of this record. All the sort of arrays of different blast beats. Mm-hmm. Well, first off, and you already know this, it's not riff-based at all. There are not melodies to pick up on. There's not even, like, looping things to get your hooks
there was a kind of a theme there, but it's really just a motif or like a figure, right? Just like and they did some different things with that. You'll hear some of that motivic stuff, but for the most part, the fast stuff on this record, it's possible that it's more riff-based than we perceive, but the overall effect is that it's just linear through written stuff. So to listen to this and to get some satisfaction out of it, you kind of have to dismiss the whole riff-based idea. You just have to listen to it moment to moment. And then everything collapses in on itself when it hits those slam parts. You know, it's interesting because this is not, like, heavy in a conventional sense, but there's this crazy gravity well effect when those slams kick in that is the result of
all this chaos that's slowly, incrementally building towards this giant release of tension. It's basically a conventional idea of brutal death or slam structuring. It's just what's happening in the fast parts is so intricate. It can just blow past you if you're not like really centered in on it. And I'm not even saying that that's like that should be expected of you, because it's fucking insane to sit here and to do that with this music. But you start listening, you listen repeatedly, you start picking up on more and more nuance. Like just listening to that again, during one of those blast sections, these super abrupt little triplet snare fills that he's doing intermittently throughout this hyperspeed blast beat. It's like, okay, I'm picking up on that. I'm picking up on some intricacies of the cymbals. I'm picking up on some multiple sets of vocals playing off each other in the space between the different channels. It's you have to have a sufficiently short attention span to appreciate it moment to moment, but sufficiently long to be able to assemble it into something that makes a little more sense.
Yeah, I could hear those things happening if I really focus in on it. And I could also feel my IQ increasing as my social skills decreased.
And now you know the secret.
and now I've got a job in programming. Listening to Brutal Death is the best career move I ever made. Anyway, so speaking of stuff, let's go on to Maniacal Disturbance. This is one of those big slams, and my only comment for this is, help, I'm slamming and I can't get up.
Let's slam. See, I'm telling you, you're getting an ear for this shit, man.
It's slowly but surely. Yeah. So apropos of what?
Apropos of you picking up on the sort of musical joke there, the fake out into the slam.
Yeah.
They do that a couple different ways. And then when they actually arrive at it, they do it with no fanfare. Usually in, like, slam death proper, you'll have the announcing riff in the manner of like a metalcore breakdown, drop out solo guitar, China, go in. Here, it just kind of slithers into it. It fakes you out a couple of times with a slowdown, blasts more, fakes out, blasts more, and then it just kind of happens out of nowhere. And it's like, gotcha.
And there is no breakdown effect from it. There are a couple other things on this record, like where I found myself doing the drunk goblin dance, You sort of like angrily hop from one foot to another. But like, this is not a slam you can dance to, and it's not one slam. This is sort of like the proverbial lattice work of slams approach you speak of, right?
Yeah, I would say the more direct connection would be Suffocation on Pierce from Within, because they would play around with ideas like this, these slithering, elaborate, slow death metal parts that are like way too technical for how slow they are,
It's a little bit like what I was saying about those things that work like breakdowns but aren't breakdowns on the band that sounds like Morbid Angel, Alchemy of Flesh.
Alchemy of Flesh.
I'm just going to have
hard name
such
to
a hard
remember.
time remembering that name. Yeah, please name your band something else. But differently, because those were all sort of physically satisfying in the way breakdowns are. This is just like horrible and disorienting.
Yes.
And
yes.
you can feel you're just sort of being buffeted between slams, and it's hard to tell when one ends and the next begins. It's all this kind of crawling continuum. But it is you can't dance to it, you can't headbang, but it is very heavy. It's just sort of like, oh.
You're at the amusement park, and you're in the bumper cars, and everyone's car is working except for yours.
Ooh, that's good.
It's just and nobody has any mercy for you and your broken car, and the carny walked away to have a smoke, and you're just getting pummeled by 8-year-olds the entire time.
If you don't have enough surreal anxiety dreams, you should listen to Brutal Death.
Yes.
And another thing I was going to say, really in this thing, what strikes me is the snare. Although, obviously, I much prefer the violently pinging snare of a lot of this stuff, but this hollowed out snare here. It sounds kind of good. It's not only is it not clicky, it's kind of it's got this weird, just sort of weirdly consistent woody thwack.
Yeah, it's got like a wood block effect. I think if we listened to isolated drum tracks from this, what you would hear was an incredibly expensive drum production. I bet most of the recording budget was spent just on the drums. It gets occluded a little bit because the guitars just have that kind of square wave quality, but you can hear, oh wow, this is very, very tightly recorded drumming, which is cool because it's kind of the centerpiece of this music, I think. So, real quick, nothing really special about the sample. It's just a cool part that almost sounds like a song. This is off the final track, Formless Transmigration. And here, this is going to be a little bit like your first sample off Delirious Urges. You're going to hear some things that are kind of like death metal riffs, just very wrong. So yeah, that's almost music, right?
I almost heard a pentatonic scale.
Yeah. I at this point, so to kind of wrap things back around, there was a period in from 99 to maybe 05 where almost all Brutal Death sounded kind of like this. And now it's kind of a niche sub-style. This very flat, very dry, entirely driven by technical performance and yet completely unflashy. I've never heard music so technical that is so disinterested in impressing the listener. It's just like, yeah, I'm just doing this. Fuck you. I'm doing this riff you'll never be able to play. It doesn't matter. It's like, and it's, I don't know, man. Because to tell people, I've heard Cerebral Effusion before, and I was never that into them. Kind of for the same reasons that I'm really liking this today. I've come around to enjoying how dry and how difficult this music is, and how it's not really brutal in the way that we think of it. It's alienating. It's like brutal death metal by way of Franz Kafka.
How's it going? Connor here from Oncology, and you're listening to Terminus.
All right, we are back after some impenetrable slam work with Wyrtgurn's A Legacy of Spite on Nebula Aeterna Productions, a cool tape label. And Nebula Aeterna is pretty new. I think they've only got like the Bandcamp. Oh yeah, and this is from Pennsylvania, or Pennsylvania and Maryland. Confusing. East Coast, and they have got like 5 releases out on the Bandcamp, and they so they do digital and tape. And one of them, this label has a pretty good batting average, because one of the 5 is Devilgroth's Sviatogor, which is on track to be very high on our the Terminus aggregate year-end list. Mm-hmm. We reviewed that a couple months back.
We reviewed that back in January or February.
Jesus.
Man.
Yeah. Well,
the time flies.
Oof. But yeah, so that was very abstract, swirling kind of Russian blazebirth via certain post-rock sensibilities, kind of black metal. Really just true art shit. This, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, is also great. So this is, you were saying just before we went on that this one kind of threw you for a loop.
Yeah, this one is like... This is one of those cases, I mean, it only happens a few times a year for either of us. Mm-hmm. It feels like this is accessing some sort of musical DNA that I just don't know. Like, it's some sort of... Like, we talk about the idea of, like, a blind spot for us. Mm-hmm. This feels like it's accessing a blind spot. I like it a lot, but I would be very hard-pressed to describe it accurately,
Yeah, okay, so here is basically what... So this was billed to me as crusty black metal with approaching death metal. I certainly agree that the overall vibe... Yeah, it's like the overall vibe isn't that black metal, for sure. At least not in the sense that people usually expect these days, is kind of, second wave rooted stuff. It seems to be a simple and really good idea that I've been interested in for a while, which is just like black metal plus stenchcore, which have usually been sort of on the opposite ends of like never the twain shall meet. And you could attempt to weave those together in a certain way, maybe in a way that would be like kind of those bands around Samain, the Celtic knot bands around Samain that we were talking about in that bonus episode. But you were like early primordial plus amoebics or whatever, right? But this is simple. This appears to be a pretty straightforward, just like songs. These are stenchcore songs. They're structured as sort of like old school, just primitively chugging tracks with some explosive blast beats, and the blast beat parts are more like disciplined black metal kind of riffing, and riffing that is sort of, because everything's been kind of, genre ghettoized, riffing that's usually understood as being part of a different universe, right? These are kind of these are sort of glorious, epic riffs that are very much in the BM style of the last 6 years, right?
Yeah, to a degree. But, well, in the past 6 years, it doesn't sound like Franco-Finnish at all. It's something that's interesting is that this sounds like very deeply American in significant ways, but also not really in the outlaw rock style we've talked about on the show. Mm-hmm. The closest thing I can compare this to, which was one of your favorites of last year, was Mortem from New Jersey.
Yeah, I would say Mortem is pretty core outlaw rock for me, or pretty important to that, but definitely one of the less rocky.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think maybe a similar thing is going on here, where the one of the core of Mortem's sound. Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. Core of Mortem's sound is riffing style that you can hear is influenced by the French stuff, for instance, but is really stripped down, centered around more kind of aggressive kind of masculine melodic structures, and at the same, and then played really raw, played on the low end of the guitar, and played in dialogue with just straight up breakdowns, right? Mm-hmm. And like two steps and stuff like that, and also just big expansive mid tempo parts that just sort of rock out in a very kind of almost grungy American way. Yeah. And this record certainly has that kind of dynamism between, okay, we're going to have a very blasty, black metal-y part with sort of expansive melodic riffing, but the melodies won't be sort of sentimental or vampiric or nocturnal at all in the kind of French way. They'll be more sort of robust, and then they just throw into breakdowns. The difference being that here the band is just not really like. Mortem's breakdowns usually have a textured thing. They're still like working with like ringing, clanging, black metal-ish chords, or things that you could hear in kind of like old stench type stuff, or even screamo, whatever. But just like big, like the breakdowns have some of the melodic color in them too. Whereas here,
Mortem is big in a way.
Mortem is big, and this is, as you say, very dungeon sounding.
This is super dungeony.
It's ugly and loud, but it's not about vast expanses and mountains and things like that.
Now this is like grumbly goblin music, which is cool. I've talked about that on the show. It's like we need more grumbly goblin black metal. Call it like low stakes black metal. It's not about it's not about destroying the world or killing God. It's about like, I'm in a dungeon, I'm a goblin, this sucks, my feet hurt, etc.
Yeah. And so, wait, I'll return to that in a sec, but just structurally, basically, this works around, like, extreme discontinuity effects. Like, you just get the epic riff, and then, like, bam, breakdown. And the breakdowns are played in sort of dissonant power chord structure, straight out of the old stench stuff, or probably also things like Celtic Frost, right, which come indirectly through like Deviated Instinct or Amoebics, but Celtic Frost is like the Jeweled Throne riff is, I think, a big direct influence here.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the whole I picked up on it towards the end, but usually I can pick up on kind of the hardcore vibe of a black metal record, especially like an American black metal record, pretty quickly. This one, it took me to like the end of the album to be like, oh, okay, so that's the kind of weird thing I've been hearing.
And that's funny because it is like, because it's not really hardcore, like Amoebics isn't really a hardcore band. Yeah, like it's this sort of, or like Deviated Instinct has hardcore parts, or Prophecy of Doom, these hardcore parts, but it's not really hardcore. And so what you're hearing is the fact that it's drawing on this strand of headbang and mosh-based punk stuff that's already extremely gritty and medieval.
Yeah, I think that's probably the blind spot is, because the whole kind of stenchy thing is, I mean, I really only know that by way of you, apart from listening to Amoebics and basically liking it in the past.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. I mean, it is a tiny niche, and many of the latter-day bands that have placed themselves in that niche are just not that interesting. So, without further ado, there may be some doubters saying, surely this doesn't sound like a sort of obscure school of, Anglo-barbarian axe metal. And to that I say, let's listen to Moat of Eels.
I want to say, for the record, I am so disappointed that there is, like, no trace of emo influence on this, so I could say Moat of Feels.
Well, either way, certainly the song title of the year, immediately gives you a feel. Yeah, very consistent with Grumbling Goblin. Like that's like on the nightly agenda for the Grumbling Goblin is avoid the Moat of Eels.
Of course, you choose the track that the most perfectly on the whole album proves your thesis. You know?
Yeah.
To be fair, that's like way more obvious than anything else on it.
It went for I went for the most concentrated dose of it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So the trem riffing there is more death metal-y, and also by that way close to that kind of savage single string Axis of Advance kind of stuff that Mortem does sometimes.
Oh yeah, and it's also also very like old bolt thrower.
Oh no, that for sure is. No, I was talking about the trem, like the trem leads. But yeah, no, riff is dun 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 dun. Yeah, no, that's a In Battle There Is No Law for sure. Or Realms of Chaos. So yeah, I mean, I count Bolt Thrower as a like just the most developed stench band. So yeah, it doesn't really sound like Amoebics. What it really sounds like is Deviated Instinct and Bolt Thrower, and maybe like Sacrilege.
I can definitely pick up on the Deviated Instinct because, like, that the way that main riff keeps concluding in that which is like Deviated Instinct or some of the other bands from that era where it's like we're kind of crusty punk dudes who really like heavy metal, but we're kind of retarded, so we're putting in like an Iron Maiden lead, but it's way too chromatic, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and they're like listening to Slayer, but knew they couldn't like imitate a Slayer riff directly, right?
So we'll try to get the effect of Slayer, but in a way they can play. Yeah,
exactly. So yes, you're right. That's very Deviated Instinct, or just the way that it starts off. Like, I mean, the whole stench thing in part is like the crust punk analogy to like jump to fuck up kind of tough guy hardcore or new metal riffing, right? It's just like very, very, it's like cargo shorts and dreadlocks, right? So like that it just starts up, that it just drops in with that sort of like, group, like funky, just sort of like lights into that funky breakdown immediately with no build up. That is just super, super stench.
Yeah, it's cargo shorts and dreads, but before they became vegan.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, no, that's the wonderful... The nice thing about the old stench stuff is that it's very difficult to, especially Amoebics, but any of those bands, they don't... The vibe... Axe Grinder more so. Axe Grinder on their record had, not death metal, peace metal. But like, a lot of these other bands were a lot grittier, right? So this is... basically, yes, haha, I proved my point, and I fucking love that song. And the only other thing I want to say, like, they just move through different kinds, the whole way of writing, of just moving through different kinds of crushing mid-tempo mosh riffs is kind of characteristic of that style, right? So, like, hey, we did the breakdown, now let's do the driving downbeat riff, and like then let's do the two-step. Okay, now just like make everything feed back and just puke. Right. And
it's also akin to that style because it's all centered around a single riff. It's you're branching off of that single riff and you just keep coming back to it over and over again. Yeah.
It's very intuitive physical playing. The other thing I was going to say, listening to it now, it's really clear. This band has a really good drummer.
Yeah. He's doing a lot of very subtle, not flashy, but challenging stuff.
And just playing it with just tremendous gusto and the sort of like the you can't put your finger on it, but just like grooving really hard. Just like you can play. It is with latter day bands imitating this style. Actually, even with Axe Grinder, I mean, I think Axe Grinder is kind of not very good, and they just don't have, at least on Rise of the Serpent Man, they just don't have the kind of rhythmic. They don't have the kind of rhythmic power going on that the other bands from that time had. This band is just like, these guys get it, right? And the drummer just pushes the tempo, just any chance he gets to drive the riff home further by just smacking a tom or something, he does. It's like not flashy playing at all, right? But it's really good, and the drums are like mic'd really well.
Yeah, no, it's I think he is perhaps one of the driving forces of this band. You know, he's hanging out in the background. He's not blowing everyone away in front of him, but he's really forming the core of this stuff.
That's actually kind of what I was, when we were listening again, I was thinking that, but I thought, oh, you're just exaggerating that because you're trying to have a spicy take. But I'm glad you heard that too.
No, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
so it's like,
it's
clearly low key a drummer band.
It's low-key a drummer band, and it's also... But I think that also happens in bands where I'm going to go out on a limb, but I think I'm like 98% certain these are songs made through jamming in a practice space.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. No, these are
maybe just like the core band is one of the guitarists and a drummer or whatever. I don't even know what the personnel is on this. And it's not easy to find out because it's not on Metal Archives.
Yeah. We finally graduated, boys. We are finally true cult. All right, so let's go to the next track. This is called The Kingstone. This is one of the longer tracks on the record. And this is where, so I'm not coming from that kind of like punk-oriented background, so I have to compare it to what I do know. And this is interesting because you've got stuff that, I guess, in a sense, one of the things this reminds me the most of is like Archgoat. But with a very different mood, because Archgoat wants to be evil and cool, slow war metal to mosh to. This is, what if Archgoat were a bunch of grumpy goblins in the dungeon? As I keep going back to. So you're going to have stuff that sounds like Archgoat. You're going to have stuff that sounds a little bit like maybe the self-titled Burzum record. And then a little bit of stuff that sounds like Mortem. But also something worthy of mention is, more than a lot of black metal bands in general, vocals are a really guiding thread to this music. Because structurally, since this is jammed out, it's very intuitive, but it can also come out like a little bit arbitrary sometimes. But the vocals are put together in a way that they really provide that narrative thread through the music that kind of holds everything together. So,
all right, cool.
Yeah, let's try this one. it's a ton of development, and then they get to that tremolo riff at the end, that dun 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 dun. There you go. That puts it all together. That's very Mortem.
And the big sort of slanging epic power chords before that. That's pretty Mortem too. Those last two riffs really do remind me. You're really right on with that.
Yeah, and another band that I would compare these guys to, who are... These guys probably are familiar with them because they become kind of a house band of the New England scene, is... I think I've talked about them on the show before, but I don't know if you've listened to them. One Master.
Checked out a couple times in the past. For whatever reason, didn't really follow up with it much. But yeah, that was an active... that was another band that was active at the genesis of the nowadays underground and has since, is not as high profile anymore.
Yeah, no, I really like One Master a lot. One Master are basically this plus more Judas Iscariot. But they've got that same sort of like nasty kind of rockin' feel, especially in their later stuff. But I thought this was really interesting because this fuses a lot of different ideas, but the thing that's missing is second wave black metal.
Yes, yeah.
Apart from these little gestures towards early Burzum, but those could be parallel evolution. And it's kind of weird in and of itself, and that's one of the things that makes me think this is so distinctly American. There's an almost deliberate rejection of everything associated with kind of traditional Norwegian black metal, which it's kind of hard to do. It's kind of hard to create. I mean, I see this as a black metal record, perhaps more than you do, but
I'm willing to see it as. I mean, I'm pretty expansive about that. If I'm does it feel authentically grim and medieval, and I tend to like to try to. I mean, in some ways, obviously, I think the definition of black metal has expanded in all the wrong ways, right? But sure, why is our idea of serious black metal confined to stuff in the second wave or third wave vein when, you can make stuff like this that sounds kind of like Celtic Frost and it's just as serious, right?
Yeah. And,
so I feel that. The other thing is just, comparing things to, something like Amoebics has the same spiritual seriousness as black metal, so to me it's almost calling this medieval barbarian stench with blast beats. It's like apples. It's like 2 of one, half. What's the phrase? 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
There you go. No, it's but actually another thing I would compare this to that we've covered on the show is Aphelion, that band from Missouri. Who now obviously Aphelion is a band that's a work in progress. It's not fully formed yet. But they got kind of a similar thing of dungeony, rockin' American black metal that seems to deliberately eschew these ideas of European supremacy in terms of riffcraft and structure, because they have a similar feel of songs that are sort of elaborate black metal rock songs that are jammed out and iterated on within the practice space. You know what I mean? Yeah. So this was just very interesting to me. This is one of the parts that really stuck out, especially with some of the riffs on this are these are the ones that really grabbed me. It's
I mean, you might be right also. Just sort of rejection of second wave as a primary influence is pretty well, it's both characteristic of American BM at its worst and its best, right?
Yeah. Or at least rejection of it as the center of black metal.
No, I hear what you mean, because so much of the American stuff is based on, so much of the cult American stuff is based on French and German, and I guess just marginal Norwegian being Ildjarn, right? Yeah,
I get that.
It's what's canonical? Ildjarn, Bilskirnir, a bunch of French bands, some Finnish bands, and those are templates for the big, glorious melodic sounds in USBM, rather than any Norse or Swedish stuff.
Like, these guys might not even listen to Immortal. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right, what do you got next?
This one is another... This is really good for cool titles. This is a good example of a dark fantasy record that's not some sort of gimmick about... It's not like, based on X series of novels or whatever. These people are just good at thinking of dark fantasy images, right? We got, this one is called Castle of the Wolf. But while I'm talking about the dark fantasy thing, it's like, I wonder if, as far as a fictional reference point, I wonder if they're into the Cthonic Cerebral novels, which were just nominally YA kind of stuff, but it's just really fucking good. And, we read it back in the day, but actually reread a bit of it recently, and it's still pretty sick. But they've got a track called Mordicant as the second track, and that is a kind of, a sort of liquid flame burning undead construct in the Cerebral books. Just cool sort of like grim necromancy shit. So, I'm wondering if that's a vibe here. But anyway, let's check out Castle of the Wolf, and this is just a good example of the more kind of, what we were just talking about, the more sort of noble melodic flourishes on here. Yeah, so I would say that sample kind of runs the gamut of everything on this record. Like,
yeah,
very
has all the constituent parts.
Yeah, very abruptly, which is also characteristic of this record. Is like doing very sudden stylistic transitions and pulling it off naturally. But so yeah, at the end we get just like from we do. It's almost a thing that slam bands do, right? We get like an ignorant breakdown followed by an even more ignorant breakdown.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to the joke among me and my friends that I've been playing music with for a long time is you got to have the breakdown, then you slam the breakdown, then you break down the slam. Just keep making it slower every time.
Yeah, so they definitely do that, right? But before that, we just got a rapid deceleration from the blast riff into the breakdown. And we get basically a stylistic shift from like more, from this sort of latter day post 2000s black metal style to like, back to the stenchy stuff. So that trem riff, what's remarkable, right, is that what raises this from like a pretty damn cool album or like a fun album to a great album is they rarely play riffs that fancy. but when they do, they nail it. Like, that is, that's a considerably, the sort of, like, flamboyant, flowing melody there you get, and the sort of weirdly turned major key ideas, you could trace to that whole flowery Vothana Gratzug school that's really big now. Mm-hmm. But they're doing it with these kind of death metal-y leads chasing each other, at least half the time, and putting in a really kind of powerful, high-tension disharmonies in part of it. I think they changed the way they're voicing it over various repetitions. It's got this kind of loose feel that's very what black metal is right now. I don't know, man. Like, that's a really, really, really good riff. And to be able to be basing your record around this sort of low-end chug stuff, and you might think, oh, they're just using the blast for contrast, or the black metal gestures here are kind of superficial, it's just because everyone likes black metal now. Well, that was, really good.
Yeah, that's a really interesting riff in general. You know, this record manages to get away with a lot of kind of eccentric gestures like that, because on a lot of records I would hear that come kind of out of nowhere, like not really precedented earlier on the record, and I'd be like, okay, so you've been sitting on this riff for a long time, you wanted it recorded, you jammed it into a song, that kind of thing. I mean, we've all fucking done it. But here it's like, even in its eccentricity, and even as abrupt as this band usually operates structurally, it still manages to land. And what I was saying while it was playing was like, well, that's almost like a Swarm riff. Like, you know, that like climbing ecstatic thing, because it's not really a triumphant black metal riff in the way we would usually think of it. Not even like for the really flowery French bands that, you know, we like, and especially me. That has its own vibe. I mean, that's one of the only things I could compare it to, is like the really crazy shit that comes out of Japan. You know, it's like, it's just too bold, it's too colorful for black metal, but it sticks the landing, you know?
Given that these guys are sort of like, given that these guys are sort of like conversant in both the deepest reaches of BM and like punk scene stuff, it's quite possible they like stuff like, you know, Swarm and Envy, right? Yeah.
And yet this really at no point feels like it's substantially emo influenced.
You know,
or anything.
No. Although if you wanted to think of a record that kind of does shit like this, even has a similar sort of tonal quality, One-Eyed God Prophecy.
Okay, yeah, I keep meaning to check them out, because we were talking about that the other day, the Union of Uranus, One-Eyed God Prophecy link, yeah.
Yeah, you hear, because One-Eyed God Prophecy is more like, you know, it's very like tense in a way that's characteristically screamo, right? Whereas this album is just like a release from beginning to end, right? This is just like 40-minute orgasm, or 30-minute, you know, 40 minutes. But like, you know, yeah, One-Eyed God Prophecy is like, why do we call it screamo? Not sure, because it sounds like Demerstyris, Dom Satanas, and Deviated Instinct. And so, like, in terms of sort of sounding very North American, because they're Canadian, and also sort of running, kind of crossing thing, like accessing parts of the extreme music spectrum that are normally sort of highly segregated from each other, like, that's, I think, a decent comparison, because it's got these very melodic tremedy stuff and just this really chuggy grinding stuff, and it all is kind of murky, you know?
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's really no reason that these things should be apart from each other, especially when you're going to, like, the older, more primordial ideas of them. Because, I mean, there's just so much cross-pollination, or at least convergent evolution in terms of, you know, ideas. It's like you can go back, and there's ways you can slot Judas Iscariot into a lot of very different scenes back in the 90s. You know? So real quick, last sample, we're gonna go with the final track, Blood of Bastard Prince. And like I said, it took me so long to pick up on this sort of understated but insistent hardcore influence. You're calling it kind of like a stench thing. I'm calling it hardcore just because there's breakdowny shapes in this music, but they're swathed in this, garagey black metal production, and they're not really... they're not breakdowny in the way that I usually describe certain black metal stuff as. Because, there's, very little palm muting. It's just, there are these big open gestures, which I guess probably relates more towards, real authentic hardcore punk that I'm just not really that familiar with. Mm-hmm. But, let's listen to this part right up front from the top of the track, and you can tell me what this sounds like, because you almost certainly know better than me.
All right.
Okay, so listening to that again, I've generated theories, but what do you think this is?
I mean, there's a lot going on there. It really
especially
sounds
at the end. That's
yeah.
shaped like a breakdown, but different.
Wait, do you mean the bum ba ba dum ba ba dum?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, no, I mean, I think like the reference point for all this stuff is it's hardcore only to the extent that there's hardcore in this sort of heavy crust stuff. My thought about it would be there's a bit of a blind spot for me in terms of bands I would probably be interested in, but that I just never got, that I either I knew about but didn't quite pick up on back in the day, or that I just haven't gotten to. But Agramonia is a kind of really, it's sort of stenchy stuff, but it's highly atmospheric, and carries a lot more sort of melodic color in it. You could think of just epic Neurosis stuff, but with that more sort of grinding, intense undertone that Neurosis occasionally has, but kind of moved away from. I mean, also Neurosis, just sort of cascading, but a lot of it feels like this band is just naturally developing ideas naturally developing rhythmic ideas from this old school slow grinding crust and bolt thrower stuff, and overlaying it with melodic texture that was coming more from black metal, which is cool. Like, at the moments where they mesh the styles, it's like black metal melodic overlay over these crust structures. Cool, skillful, well done, and different from like the sort of epic crust or things like Agrimony or whatever. It's going to sound more like Neurosis, or it's going to sound more like Screamo in the chording, right? And if you follow the epic crust thing too far, you end up with Fall of Ephrafa and nonsense like that. Fucking band about rabbits. But like but so I think it's I think it's pretty consistent with what I've been saying. It's just like they're taking those kinds of elemental mosh riffs and giving them a more color, I think.
Okay. Well, it's funny because I was following a similar thread, and especially with that opening riff, and then all these big melodic gestures, but also in these kind of breakdowny formats, I went to thinking about like Stormcrow.
Yeah, no, Stormcrow's exactly in that kind of intermediate territory, like or Skaven is another one from that time period. Yeah. Skaven is pretty cool. I like them better than Stormcrow. But yeah, no, I feel like those later American bands have never, to me, nailed the rhythmic power in the bands they're imitating. But although I need to revisit Stormcrow. But like Skaven is really cool just in terms of how it has almost this sort of post-rock or like kind of almost Indian summer delicacy, plus just is like absolutely disgusting. Right.
You gotta have some retarded with your smart, or you become prog.
Yeah, so I mean, basically that's the feeling I get on this. You had some left field hypothesis you wanted to share, or was it Stormcrow?
Oh, it was the Stormcrow thing. I think there's...
Stormcrow is right around the same time as some band like Agramonia, or maybe a little earlier, but it's similar nexus.
Yeah, I think that there's this... I wasn't so sure when you said it up front, but listening through these again, I'm pretty convinced of your thesis that these guys are coming out of the punk scene. There's just not these regular kind of black metal gestures that you would expect. And the negative space is filled in with some of those more obscure, like, punk wing of extreme music touches, and I think that all makes sense.